Okay, let's unpack this. You've likely heard the buzz, right? Maybe even some pretty loud warnings about artificial intelligence potentially reshaping the job market.
Oh, absolutely. It's everywhere.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into some source material that puts a particularly stark perspective right in front of us.
Yeah, the material we're looking at today, it's specifically excerpts from an MSNBC segment digging into an Axios piece. And it talks about something, well, pretty unsettling.
Unsettling how?
They use a phrase that really grabs your attention. A potential white-collar bloodbath driven by AI.
White-collar bloodbath. Wow, okay, that phrase alone is designed to make you sit up. And this perspective, it's coming from someone right at the forefront of building this tech.
Exactly. The source highlights a warning from Dario Amodei. He's the CEO of Anthropic, one of the leading creators of large language models.
Anthropic, right.
Well,
So we're getting insight potentially straight from well, not the horse's mouth directly, but maybe a report on his perspective about what they think is coming and why.
that's the idea. Our mission for this deep dive is really to pull out the most important insights from this specific viewpoint.
Okay.
Understanding what this bloodbath might look like based on this source's account,
Yeah.
how quickly they suggest it could arrive, and maybe why, surprisingly, not many people seem to be openly discussing it.
So think of this as getting a shortcut to one particular, potentially urgent perspective from someone really deep in developing this tech.
Precisely. We want to grasp the core message here. What this expert believes is on the horizon, the potential speed of the change, and why it matters so much for the future of white-collar work.
And the source suggests it could impact, what was it, a huge number of entry-level jobs.
Yeah, potentially impacting as many as half of entry-level jobs. That's the figure being reported from his perspective.
Half. It's interesting because, this echoes past technological shifts, like the IT revolution's impact on blue-collar roles.
Right.
But the difference highlighted in this source seems to be the potential speed and just the sheer breadth of this change.
That's exactly what they emphasize, the speed and the scope.
All right, let's dig into what really stands out from the source material, this striking warning about a white-collar bloodbath. Who exactly is the source attributing this alarm to?
As you mentioned, it points directly to Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic.
Okay.
And the source really emphasizes that Anthropic is one of the top creators of these large language models globally. They suggest Amodei has visibility into the power of this tech that, well, very few others do. Maybe only 2 or 3 other people in the world is the implication.
Wow, okay, so someone who truly understands what this technology is capable of deep down, and he's the one reportedly using the term white-collar bloodbath. That's incredibly strong language.
It really is.
Based on this source, what specifically does he project? What are the numbers?
Well, his projection, based on their early analysis of the technology's capabilities, it's that over the next 5 years, this could essentially eliminate half of white-collar entry-level jobs.
Half in 5 years.
Yeah. And he suggests, as a result of that scale of disruption, unemployment could potentially jump to between 10% and maybe even 20% within that same 5-year period.
10 to 20% unemployment from this. That really paints a picture of widespread disruption. Now, this source also brings up the idea that many people seem hesitant to talk about this. Who are they saying is kind of avoiding the conversation and why?
Well, they suggest a few groups. The AI companies themselves might be reluctant to discuss it openly, maybe to avoid causing, public panic.
Makes sense.
The source also points out that lawmakers and the federal government aren't really leaning into this conversation yet. And perhaps unsurprisingly, Wall Street isn't particularly eager to discuss it either.
So even the people building the tech and those in positions of power seem reluctant to publicly discuss the potentially negative job impacts. If that's the case, why does Amodei feel compelled to speak out, according to this source? What's driving him?
The perspective offered is that Amodei feels this kind of dual obligation. Yes, an obligation to build the technology.
Right.
But also a really significant obligation to push the federal government, lawmakers, other AI companies, to proactively figure out how to prepare and, well, protect the American worker. He seems to believe it necessitates a national-level debate.
Okay, so it sounds like a sense of profound responsibility is driving him to raise this alarm, even if it's an uncomfortable message.
That's the framing.
The source also connects this warning to what business leaders are grappling with right now. What do they say about the decisions CEOs are currently facing?
Yeah, the Axios CEO featured in the segment shares his own experience. He says he's spending just an enormous amount of time studying AI for his own business, anticipating it will radically change the composition of their company. And he believes every company CEO globally is doing the same thing.
Constantly asking.
Constantly asking, do I need to fill this role? Or will a machine be able to do this job better than a person in the next couple of years? That's the core question they're wrestling with.
And that lines up perfectly with the projection that entry-level jobs might be the most immediately vulnerable, right?
Exactly.
And this source links it to some current trends we might already be seeing.
Yes, they do. They note that recent data showing college graduates having difficulty finding jobs. That could actually be an early indicator. What are the first signs that this significant shift is already beginning to happen?
Interesting connection. Now, it's quoted in the source that Amodei says, you cannot stop this train, but you can steer it. In this context, what does steering it actually look like, according to him and this source?
Steering, from this perspective, it really begins with just acknowledging the reality and sounding the alarm, initiating that national debate we talked about.
So step one is awareness.
Right, and the source stresses this isn't some distant future problem like 10 years out. They highlight it could potentially be 6 months from now, or maybe 12 months, when we start seeing significant impacts.
6 to 12 months. That's considerably faster than I think many people might imagine.
They're faster.
Okay, so if you can't stop it, how do you manage it or steer it to protect workers from just being displaced?
Well, the conversation needs to shift, according to this source, from simply talking about displacement to focusing on augmentation.
Augmentation, meaning?
Meaning, the key is ensuring workers are prepared and equipped to use these AI tools, to use them to enhance their existing work, make themselves more productive, rather than just being replaced by the technology outright.
Okay, using AI with the job. And what are companies like the one mentioned in the source doing about this right now? Are they actively trying this?
The Axios CEO gave a specific example from his own company. They're giving everyone access to the technology they have, a partnership with OpenAI apparently.
Right.
And they are actively pushing every single team and individual to experiment with it. Just try it out.
Why? What's the goal?
The goal is for the staff themselves to figure out how to use AI to augment their own work, find ways to integrate it, and hopefully avoid being displaced down the line. He actually made a very blunt statement to his staff. He said it's essentially committing career suicide if they aren't spending, say, 10% of their day actively experimenting with the technology.
Career suicide for not experimenting. Wow, that really drives home the perceived urgency from that business leader's viewpoint.
It certainly does.
But the source suggests most people aren't really engaging with AI in this way yet. Why do they think that is?
They suggest a few reasons. Maybe people tend to view AI as still too futuristic, kind of like science fiction.
Yeah, I can see that.
Or perhaps just as a slightly better search engine, you know? They aren't really exploring its full capabilities. Maybe they feel they don't have the time, or they're just preoccupied with their daily lives and jobs.
So the concern is?
The concern is that many might not fully grasp the reality of its potential impact until it's, well, too late to adapt easily.
And if lawmakers are also slow to react or adapt, the source suggests there could be significant political consequences down the road.
Absolutely. If Amodei's projection of, say, 10–20% unemployment were actually to materialize, this source believes it could very likely lead to widespread political instability, maybe unrest. And it's interesting the source mentions this concern over potential instability isn't limited to just one side of the political spectrum. They note figures like Steve Bannon on the right and others on the left are reportedly worried about similar scenarios playing out.
So a potentially bipartisan concern about the downstream effects. It really sounds like understanding and integrating AI tools is rapidly moving from a nice-to-have skill to something absolutely essential, even for seemingly basic tasks.
The source really emphasizes that point. They basically argue it would be foolish not to use AI tools now to, say, research a company or a topic before a job interview.
Makes sense.
It's presented not just as the future of work, but really as the present. And they predict white-collar workers right across the country will be profoundly affected.
The source also touched on how this might specifically impact certain fields, like journalism was discussed. Are the machines expected to do the core reporting? Is that the idea?
No, that's not what this source suggests. The AI isn't expected to replace the core investigative journalism itself, the actual reporting on the ground.
Okay.
However, the source points out that AI is already quite capable of handling tasks around journalism. Things like copy editing, assisting with marketing efforts, conducting background research, or quickly generating variations of content for different platforms.
So it's more about potentially automating specific functions and augmenting existing roles, at least initially, rather than a full replacement in some of those creative or investigative areas.
Yes, but the source also brings it right back to the fundamental business calculation.
Which is?
They point out that assuming AI's limitations, things like producing hallucinations, where it generates incorrect or just nonsensical information.
Right, the errors.
Assuming those errors continue to improve, and the AI reaches a level of effectiveness comparable to humans for certain tasks, any company executive would likely choose automation. Why? Because they anticipate it will increase profitability over time. That's the bottom line driving factor.
That's a powerful driver for change. And the traditional argument we always hear is that technology creates more jobs in the long run, right? Doesn't that apply here?
That argument is definitely mentioned in the source that historically, technology often does lead to the creation of new kinds of jobs over the long term. That's true.
What?
However, what they stress is different in this situation is the potential velocity and scale, the sheer speed and breadth. This technology could hit with significant force in the next, say, 6 to 18 months.
That fast timeline again.
Exactly. And crucially, it has the potential to affect many different roles simultaneously across all sorts of industries, all at once.
That combination, the speed and hitting everywhere at the same time, that's what this source believes, makes this disruption potentially significantly different from past technological shifts.
That's the core of their argument about why this time might be different.
And the source finds it particularly alarming how little awareness they perceive among, say, members of Congress regarding this potential impact.
Yeah, they seem quite concerned about that, how infrequently they believe lawmakers discuss it with their constituents. They frame it almost as a disservice not to be actively thinking about what the world of work might realistically look like in just 18 months to maybe 3 years.
It certainly feels like the source is framing this as a critical and, frankly, urgent issue. The efficiency gains they mention are striking, too, suggesting what? That a small team using AI could do the work of a much larger one.
Yeah, the example given was something like 4 or 5 people who are really skilled at using AI prompts correctly could potentially handle the workload that previously required maybe 40 or 50 people.
Wow.
The source explicitly uses some pretty strong language to describe this situation. They call it a 5-alarm fire.
A 5-alarm fire. Okay. So let's try to synthesize this. What does this all really mean based on the source we explored today?
Well, the warning being sounded is clear, and it's presented with real urgency. AI isn't just some far-off sci-fi concept or just a helpful online tool anymore.
Right.
It has the potential, according to this perspective, for really rapid and widespread disruption across white-collar jobs, particularly hitting those entry-level positions hard.
And we heard that projection from the Anthropic CEO via this source that it could eliminate half of those jobs in just 5 years and potentially drive significant unemployment, maybe 10–20%.
That's the stark projection highlighted. And this perspective emphasizes that the timeline for significant impact could be very short, possibly within the next 6 to 18 months.
And critically, affecting many different types of roles all at the same time, which they suggest is different from how past technological shifts usually unfolded.
Exactly. We heard how even figures deeply involved in building the tech reportedly feel a kind of responsibility to raise the alarm and push for proactive preparation.
Yeah, that dual obligation idea. The idea isn't that you can stop this technological shift. You can't stop the train.
Right, you can't stop it, but you need to try and steer it. And according to this view, steering means focusing intensely on how workers can learn to use AI.
To augment their capabilities, right. Increase their productivity rather than just being displaced by it.
That's the key pivot, augmentation over displacement. We even heard the example of companies like Axios actively trying to integrate AI use among their staff now.
With that CEO going as far as to call it career suicide for employees not to be experimenting with the technology. Really strong words.
Very strong. The source also highlighted what they see as a gap in awareness, both maybe among lawmakers and perhaps within the general public too.
Suggesting people might be underestimating AI's current and near future capabilities.
Yeah, maybe seeing it as less capable or further off than it really is. Their conclusion seems to be that understanding and actively experimenting with AI, even for seemingly small tasks like using it for research before an interview, is rapidly becoming essential, not optional.
And if we connect this specific perspective to the bigger picture, this source frames the potential job disruption not just as an economic issue.
No, potentially as a major political one as well, with risks of instability if unemployment spikes significantly.
Okay, so this raises a really important question for you, the listener, to consider based on what we've discussed from this particular source. If the timeline for significant impact across many white-collar roles is potentially as short as 6 to 18 months,
And if learning to use AI for augmentation is presented as the key strategy to avoiding displacement.
how prepared do you feel right now? And maybe more broadly, what does this potential speed mean for how individuals, how educational institutions, how governments might need to accelerate their adaptation efforts, starting, well, basically immediately?
Yeah, something to definitely mull over as you process this deep dive.